Alerting, protecting, Cake First Alert. Welcome to This Week in Kansas with your host, Tim Brown.
Hello and welcome to This Week in Kansas. Thank you for being with us this morning. A federal grand jury has now started an investigation into loans made to Governor Sam Brownback's reelection campaign. Now, most think the scrutiny will center around loans made by Lieutenant Governor Jeff Coyler to the campaign. The session starts Monday, and already there are some very interesting bills, including one that would give school bus drivers the opportunity to pursue unemployment over the summer. We have plenty more to discuss in the show, so let's get started with the investigation into the governor's loans. And, you know, we tape on a Thursday night, and this broke Thursday, and it's the talk up in Topeka, from my understanding, in the State House. And, you know, I saw this one, and initially when the loans were made, I think it raised some eyebrows, but I don't know that there's any real secret here. Maybe I'm missing something.
Well, we don't know what the substance of the investigation is about yet. We can guess, you know, given the fact that, you know, we know that these loans were made to the Brownback reelection campaign. We know that they were made in such a way so that they could be timed along with you know, campaign reserve reporting requirements. We know that they were given back almost immediately afterwards. So we know that the whole thing was kind of an interesting bit of creative accounting. But, you know, there wasn't anything about them that at all screamed, you know, illegal or even unethical. We just, you know, saw it as kind of an odd bit of electoral shenanigans. Maybe this is just a fishing expedition. Maybe some prosecutor somewhere honestly believes that there may have been some reporting requirements that were violated, and he wants to push this issue further. Then again, you know, there might be something else going on. We really have no way of knowing at this point.
You know, Rodney, when I saw this, and initially when the loans were made, of course, we didn't find out about the first one until it was a little while after the loan was made, and, right. And I think you know, most people thought that loan was just put in place to make the governor look good,
right?
To make his numbers be closer to Davis's numbers from a fundraising standpoint. And then I didn't really understand why the subsequent things happened. You know, because it's like, well, at this point, what difference does it make? And everybody already sees how this is going down.
Well, the same amount of money loaned twice.
Right, and they did, but they did it additionally too to pad his numbers, to make his numbers appear as high as.
But then everybody knew the game.
Well, sure, but even. But you say everybody, and that, I mean everybody who's paying pretty close attention or reads the Eagle or watches the news on this channel or wherever. Absolutely. Yeah. They might know about it, but you also have to think that there's probably, well, I don't know what, 40, 50, 60% of the electorate that
if not higher,
didn't pay that much attention. Yeah.
All they saw was the headline that said, you know, Brownback ahead in fundraising over Davis.
Right, right. To me, what's interesting about this, though, is this is a federal grand jury. So a federal prosecutor, so a U.S. attorney, is the one who has decided to begin this investigation. So the question then is, what federal law was broken, or that they're trying to investigate if there was one broken? You know, and there's a little bit of spitballing that we can potentially do later, but that's where the meat and potatoes is on this right now. There's a question of a federal felony that might have been committed.
Oh, and maybe it has nothing to do with the Collier loans. You know, everybody supposes that's what it is, but maybe that's too obvious.
But the only other loan that would be a loan that Brownback himself made to his own campaign.
You know, Russell, when you look at things like this, and I want to get Michael in on this as well. Actually, Michael, let's have you jump in at this point, because I am kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this. Because, Michael, we did talk to you, I remember initially when we were doing one of the shows, I think it was maybe the first show after this, the initial loan was made, and there were some questions that you raised as to the legitimacy of this type of fundraising.
They were. I don't know enough about what these legal charges are, so I wouldn't want to speculate. I agree with you guys that we really don't know a lot of details yet about what these charges are, but the only thing I can think of is that it's my understanding that the lieutenant governor liquidated this $500,000 rather quickly, and most of us just can't go to the bank and withdraw $500,000. Even people that have means like that, it's a very complex process of selling securities and all this, and so maybe that looked a little funny to some investigators. I honestly don't know. It's sort of a sad commentary on where we are in terms of campaign finance. I tried to start my own consulting business several years ago, and my philosophy was going to be that the candidate needs to come up with a budget, and then we'll set fundraising targets based on the budget. And they had to raise some pretty significant money, but boy, we didn't get anywhere. And the reason is because the media now report how much money you've raised as a marker of how successful your campaign is. It makes no difference if there's anything you need to buy that actually costs that much money. It makes no difference if what you're spending money on is actually effective in helping you get votes or not. They simply use fundraising as a way of keeping score, and I think if that had not been the case, this would not have happened.
Well, Michael, I think case in point is this race. I mean, the governor didn't raise as much money as Davis did, particularly initially, and actually throughout the entirety of the campaign when you take these loans out, but it didn't matter. He still won.
Well, that's right. Now, to be fair, a lot of conservative groups like the Republican Governors Association did jump in, and so there were lots of independent ads run on Brownback's behalf. On the other hand, there was some of that with Davis, not as much. But your basic point is right. I mean, you need to raise a certain amount of money, and it's a pretty substantial amount of money to run a credible campaign. You can't run an effective campaign for governor on $5. But at the same time, it's just gotten so crazy that there's so much saturation with commercials and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of these campaigns are raising more money than they actually need to buy anything that would actually help them win the election, simply because fundraising is a way of keeping score. And I think what Brownback and Collier decided is, hey, let's just take this to a next level. Let's just put an extra $500,000 on the sheet, and media will be really impressed.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I've already seen comments online on several different forums that say this is a witch hunt and it's being instigated by sore losers.
Well, I suppose, but why? I mean, again, it's a U.S. attorney, and not that they are above politics, but I guess certainly there could be a witch hunt aspect to this. I just think that there has to be something there. And again, not to get too far into the weeds, but you know, one of the reasons why U.S. attorneys will create these grand juries, one that's not used that much anymore, is to investigate organized crime. And again, so as I'm racking my brain, and Russell and I were talking before the show, you know, if there was something here, because again, I can't think of what federal, I'm not a federal prosecutor, I'm not going to know the federal code, but what federal crime could have been committed. And so, you know, the light bulb that goes off is, well, maybe there's some kind of a racketeering, minuscule little thing that might have been broken in this whole process, and that's where it gets. But of course, Brownback's allies, the Republican Party in Kansas, are going to immediately scream witch hunt, sore losers. Whether it's they're sore losers or not, if Brownback and his campaign broke the law, then they should be investigated. And
you know, if we're just going to put all of this stuff on the table, let's, you know, be clear. If you're looking at social media, you can also find plenty of people who are saying, yeah, I was suspicious of these loans right from the start. And, you know, people who really know the procedures involved in transferring funds from one account to another that Michael was referring to. You know, it's really easy to do that when you're, you know, talking about, you know, a few hundred, a few thousand, maybe, you know, $10 or $20 or $50,000. It's a lot harder when you're talking about $500,000, and people are wondering about the timing of this. They're wondering about the paper trail behind it. And there were people that were all along saying, well, you know, there's got to be something going on here. Now, usually that sort of thing is dismissed because within a large campaign, there's always going to be, you know, different small vicissitudes that arise in different contexts that somebody's going to jump on, and they're going to insist, oh, well, you know, this is the key to the whole problem. This explodes the whole thing right here. We know that generally speaking, nothing comes of that. But you know, there are some people, not many, but some people that are taking a look at this news and saying, I told you, I told you.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll be interesting, and of course we'll continue to cover it in the coming days and weeks and see what happens with it. Maybe nothing, but maybe something, who knows. Let's take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about the session, which is starting just this week.
Car accident?
Devon James wins.
With our no-fee guarantee, you don't pay us anything unless we get money for you.
Devon James wins. Call 800-834-8400 and get the no-fee guarantee.
Gin Blossoms, live Friday, February 27th at the Orpheum. A benefit to fight cancer, supporting the Dragon Master Foundation. Tickets on sale now at Select a Seat.
Wouldn't it be nice if someone made Mom's life easier? Someone on call when the kids got sick. Someone with the perfect dinner idea. A team of fellow dog walkers, potty trainers, and tantrum tamers. Someone who listens, who understands, who lends a hand. Wouldn't it be nice if moms didn't have to do it all on their own? At Moms Every Day, we're making Mom's life easier.
What do you think of Wichita?
I love it. Being from Phoenix, I wanted to live in like a more spread out town. And driving around here, I'm like, this is like Phoenix. The streets are really wide. It's set up like grid paper. I'm like, I will never get lost.
Watch Jamel, Frank, and Gloria weekday mornings on Good Morning Kansas.
A new year means a new you, and the Mattress Hub is ready to change the way you sleep forever. Celebrate and save with Serta. Find instant rebates up to $300. Or buy a bed, get a bed for free. That's right, buy a Serta iSeries or iComfort and get a bed for free. Plus, elevate into luxury and save with the Queen Memory Foam on an adjustable base for just $9.99. Welcome in the new year with huge savings only at the Mattress Hub.
Follow the cheap sheet to the Mattress Hub.
Devon James wins.
Some accident victims never get the money they deserve simply because they don't know a lawyer.
Well, I'm Dustin Devon.
And I'm Richard James.
And now you know too.
Devon James wins. Call 800-834-8400.
And welcome back. If you're watching this on Sunday, the session starts tomorrow. If you're watching this on Saturday in some parts of the state, well, it still starts on Monday. But got an interesting session in front of us, as always, and a few interesting bills that we've already seen pop up. We've seen the at least the talk of possibly the religious freedom bill. We've also heard a little bit about this a bill for school bus drivers, which I thought was kind of interesting, that would allow them to claim unemployment during the summer. And that one's I was trying to correlate that to something else, and I was having a hard time in my mind as I was reading that earlier this week. But interesting bill.
Well, depending, I mean, the only thing I can correlate it to is depending on, I would suppose, I've got a member of my family who's an electrician, and he works for a union shop. If he is technically laid off because a job ended, you know, he gets unemployment, even though the shop is still trying to find him jobs. To me, with my personal philosophical presuppositions, alliteration aside, I am reticent on this for a couple reasons. One, just philosophically, the bus drivers, I mean, I'm not sure what their contract reads, but I don't know why they should necessarily get unemployment over the summer months. If they're not driving a bus, then they can do what teachers do, and if they need employment, they can go find other employment, which leads into the second reservation I have about it. If bus drivers are getting unemployment over the summer months, then are teachers going to get unemployment over the summer months? Now, the difference there is, and I shouldn't speak for public school teachers, but where I work, you can choose between a 9-month and a 12-month pay contract.
Right. But it's still the same amount of money. It's just divided.
Exactly, exactly. So I don't know. I mean, if we're going to say, well, somebody deserves to be paid over the summer, I mean, I would personally argue, a little biased maybe, that teachers, I don't get paid by the taxpayer, so whatever, but teachers, college professors who are paid by the taxpayers, they should get paid over the summer as opposed to bus drivers. Not to besmirch bus drivers, but we have to be realistic too, especially in light of budgetary problems that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah. Well, one thing to keep in mind about this bill that was being talked about is that it was only going to cover bus drivers who are employed by private contractors, which the school district enters into a relationship with. They're not talking about those bus drivers, of which there frankly are very, very few left, that are actually employees of the school district.
Well, I was going to say here in Wichita, they're all contract, I think, aren't they?
I mean, I wouldn't want to say that as a blanket statement. There are probably, some bus drivers out there that are actually employees of USD 259 or employees of another school district. But the fact of the matter is that the great majority of them are in fact contract workers, just like, the union worker in your family is a contract worker, just like construction workers are contract workers. And so I think the greater complaint that some people might have with this proposal, it's not necessarily philosophical, though I guess it connects to some larger ideas. It's more a perception thing. People look at bus driving and they assume, well, that's not a real job, isn't it? It's a part-time job. That's the sort of thing that like this old fellow I know through my congregation, had a long career at Cessna, retired, and then said, well, how can I pick up some extra money? Oh, I'll become a school bus driver. Or, kids right out of high school. I don't have enough money to go to college yet. What can I do with myself for a little while? Oh, I'll become a bus driver. Now, I think that you could speak to school bus drivers and you would hear that the demands of their job and the sort of training that's involved in it, the safety regulations that they have to go through and so forth are extensive enough that maybe we really ought to take a look at that as a profession.
Sure.
And consequently, if it's a profession, then when people are without employment in their profession, why can't they seek for unemployment benefits just like any other contract worker?
Let's have Michael jump in and get Michael's thoughts on whether or not school bus drivers should be able to claim unemployment. Michael?
Well, I was surprised by the bill, and it does, Rodney makes some good points. Well, why not the teachers then too, and the other school employees or employees of contractors? I don't know about this particular proposal, but I think there's a bigger context here, and the bigger context is that full-time, waged and salaried jobs, and of course especially jobs that are unionized in the private sector, are on the decline. And we're seeing more and more of these independent contractor type jobs that tend to pay less, they tend to pay little or no benefits, and they tend to be much less secure. There's not a lot of job security, there's no kind of tenure or seniority. And I can't speak to the specifics of school bus drivers. I've never studied that or done that for a living. But just in general, this rise of the independent contractor state is bringing with it a lot of wage pressures on blue-collar workers, and this is a way of trying to fight back in one sector.
Yeah, interesting. And, it's yet just one potential bill in a big session coming up. We'll take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll continue our session preview and talk about some of the other hot topics that will be facing lawmakers here in a few days. We'll be right back.
This Sunday, it's BOGO at New Way. Buy one medium New Way, get one free with purchase of a drink like our world-famous root beer. Crumley is even better on Sundays at New Way, a Wichita tradition.
You're gonna love the New Way Cafe. New Way. Every day's a savings day. You can shop the savings way at Jabara's Carpet Outlet.
Every day is a savings day at Jabara's Flooring Superstore.
But right now, you can save an additional 5 to 25%
on selected red tag items throughout our store.
Every day is a savings day at Jabara's Carpet Outlet.
Your home should feel comfortable. It's where you spend time with your family. Let our family keep you comfortable.
Since 1975, DNC Heating and Cooling places people and principles before profit.
We offer free in-home consultations and financing with approved credit.
At Dan's, you'll deal with the faces of my family. Our quotes are the price you'll pay. We're an independent comfort specialist trained dealer. It's hard to stop a train.
Dan's Heating and Cooling. We care about your air.
So you did evening news before.
Yes.
What excites you about doing morning TV? Because it's a little different.
It's like you're waking up going, this is what happened while you were sleeping. And people wanting to know, what do I wear in the morning? How many coats do I have to have? They're paying attention to you for that. And just what happened overnight that I need to know about so I sound intelligent going into work today.
Right, exactly.
Watch Jamel, Frank, and Gloria weekday mornings on Good Morning Kansas.
Tonight on ABC, the years to comedy has everybody singing Gallivant. The nice things people say, loved it in every way. The new hit comedy is Gallivant. ABC tonight.
And welcome back. We're going to continue our session preview with talk of some bills and some pressure, of course, that will be facing lawmakers. We saw the Supreme Court decision with school finance. I think we did Jim Ward on last week, and he seemed to think that there might be a special session even over the summer. Kind of an interesting thought there. $3 hike potentially in minimum wage. That was another Jim bill. We should have talked about that when he was on. Got some interesting letters after Jim was on. The emails. Somebody said we should have a banner behind us with a hammer and sickle on it. That was one of the comments that I got.
Really?
We got some rough emails.
Well,
these
but
last
you see,
few
the
weeks.
thing
I
is
will
that
read those, and not tonight.
We can go somewhere with that.
Yeah.
The idea that minimum wage raises are a no-starter in a conservative state because everyone's going to take a look at it and assume that it's the Bolsheviks rampaging to tear down the great edifice of American capitalism. Well, it's simply not borne out. You have had conservative states, Arkansas and elsewhere, vote for minimum wage increases with pretty significant majorities. And this is something that I think connects to a point that Michael was just making. I think that there is a very broad understanding, even if it's not understood in some sort of detailed or philosophical way, that a great many wage earners are struggling and they don't really expect government programs, whether it be the Affordable Care Act or any other type of program, to do a whole lot to fix their lot in life. But an increase in their wage would. And that's something that connects with probably, the electoral evidence is that it connects with a lot of voters that otherwise describe themselves as conservative Republicans. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that this bill brought to our conservative legislature is going to be able to, thread that particular needle. But it's certainly not impossible to contemplate happening.
Well, Rodney, let me ask you this question. Okay, if an extra $3 an hour, that money will be spent, undoubtedly. Does that give the economic boost the governor's asking for? And
like the banner that viewer sent in, talks about the minimum wage increase are nothing but show. Less than 2% of wage earners earn minimum wage. If I were to just spitball, I'm sure that Jim Ward believes in raising the minimum wage. Politically, my guess is that would be an opportunity for Democrats to put out a palm card or a literature drop or a mailer or something in 2 years to say so-and-so voted against raising the minimum wage, to try to connect to those working class voters. But the reality of the minimum wage is it affects a very, very small portion of the working population.
But I don't know if that means that only a very, very small portion of the working population is willing to support it. I mean, a lot of the working population, if you take a look at Alaska, Arkansas, these conservative states, granted, the huge majority of the employed people in those states were not making minimum wage, but they recognize that a minimum wage raise, could affect their economic future positively. And there's also the fact that while there's, endless economic discussions about the macro impact of minimum wage raises, when it's done in, a localized way, as has taken place across the United States lately, there is relatively little concrete evidence that it's actually hurting business in any kind of substantive
Michael,
way.
It's also not helping though either.
Oh,
yeah, well, Michael, let's
but these voters aren't thinking about helping business, they're thinking about helping their budget.
Let's get Michael to jump in and give his thoughts on this as well. Michael, the money would be spent, right? And even if it is only 2% of the populace, like Rodney said, it's 2%, probably need the help.
It's the old economic argument, supply side, demand side, with those of us that are more politically liberal coming down more on the demand side. Let's get that money in the pockets of people to buy things that they need and get it in the economy. And that's juxtaposed with the supply side idea that if investors have more capital, they'll create the jobs. And that's a debate we've been having for, well, a generation now. I would point out one thing, which is that it isn't actually just the workers that make exactly the minimum wage that would be affected, but those anywhere in between the old minimum wage and the new one. So if you raise the minimum wage by $2, someone who's currently making $1 over minimum wage is still going to see an increase there. So it would be more than 2%. I don't know the exact percentages, might still be small. I do tend to agree with Rodney, though, on the politics of this thing. I don't think it's so much that we're looking at the Republican legislature passing this as we're looking at the Democrats seeking a roll call vote that could be damaging to the Republicans.
All right, Michael, well, we've still got you up there. Let's talk about this religious freedom bill a little bit that we heard so much about last session that died a very quick death. Is this thing going to make a comeback?
I think it's going to make a comeback in terms of being sponsored. How far it will get, I don't know. This is a really interesting bill because you have the governor and the Senate leadership that did so much. The current Senate leadership did so much to elect, particularly the state Senate back in 2012, and now they have some of the people that they helped elect against moderate Republicans, maybe sponsoring some bills that even they think go too far. I've made the argument on the show before. I'm going to make it again. I give a little bit of credence to the idea of a creative class theory. That if you look at the real job creators, people that are doing startups in high tech, in the internet, the small businesses that may become one day big businesses, there's a lot of evidence out there that shows they are much more sensitive to a state's social climate than they are to taxes. They want to live in a place that's tolerant. They want to live in a place that welcomes diversity. They want to live in a place that welcomes immigrants, and many of them are immigrants. That's an issue for Kansas as well. And many, including those who are heterosexual, take being welcoming toward people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender as a good measure of a community's tolerance. And so the argument has been made, and I'm making it, that things like this can be economically damaging to the state.
All right, let's get your thoughts on this, guys.
I was just going to piggyback on what Michael said. You know, that point about having a welcome climate, especially for young people. There was that report that came out 2 weeks ago, maybe, that Kansas was number 7 or number 8 as far as the states that are losing population. Yeah. People are moving out of Kansas. There's only 6 or 7 states that have a greater exodus. I'm going to yes. I was trying to decide if I wanted to use that word, but yeah, basically an exodus. So we have to be very. I think that lawmakers need to be mindful of that, and quite frankly, it could be a moot point anyway if the Supreme Court decides to take up. Now that we have conflict in the appellate courts. On the question of recognizing same-sex marriage between the various states. If the Supreme Court decides to take that up, it's largely going to become a moot point.
I agree with Rodney insofar as, you know, a lot of this hanging on what the Supreme Court does in connection with same-sex marriage. I mean, you know, the Hobby Lobby case, which you know, is very much tied up with so many of these state-level efforts. You know, it takes a look at the Affordable Care Act and the contraception mandate. It takes a look at questions regarding religious liberty. It takes a look at labor law. It takes a look at many, many different things. But permeating the entire debate is the question of same-sex marriage and the status of the social as well as the legal recognition of gay marriage within the United States. When and if the Supreme Court decides that. I mean, I put the if on there just to cover my bases, but I'm certain it will have to. When the Supreme Court comes down with a definitive decision on this, it's going to scramble a whole lot of the motivations that created the Hobby Lobby case in the first place, that created so many of these state level and local level efforts. That's not to say that, you know, the people that are genuinely concerned about religious liberty, you know, should simply do nothing. The same way the people that, you know, care a great deal about creating a welcoming environment should just sit back and do nothing. But we need to recognize that the elephant in the room has still not sat down. Right. And when that elephant sits down, wherever that elephant sits down, it's going to tilt the playing field in all of these discussions about, how, you know, religiously oriented individuals can operate their businesses, you know, how religiously motivated individuals can perform their public service jobs. It's going to put it all in a different channel.
All right. This session all gets back to the budget, though. That seems to be I mean, that's what it all comes back to, and that's what the struggle will be, and we're going to discuss the budget right after this.
From picking the perfect color to our outstanding no prep, no prime formula, Menards and Dutch Boy make transforming your world easy. Go Dutch. Dutch Boy Platinum Paint, available at Menards.
Moms Every Day with Rachel Phillips, brought to you by the sponsors of momseveryday.com.
Welcome back to Moms Every Day. I'm Rachel Phillips. With me today, my special guest is Leanne from the Treehouse in Wichita. Thanks for coming over today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, if you haven't heard about the Treehouse, this is an incredible program. Tell us a little bit about it.
The Treehouse was established to help moms who have a baby and they don't have the necessary supplies or possibly education to know how to take care of the baby. So when they bring their baby home, we give them a layette that consists of diapers, formula, new clothes, bottles, pretty much everything they need other than furniture to take care of the baby. We then make them one of our clients and try to get them enrolled in parenting classes. We offer everything from basic parenting skills to nutrition, how to do a resume, life skills, pretty much everything we can to improve both their parent skills and their ability maybe to get into the workforce, or depending on what their individual goals are.
And we're really talking about a generational impact, because changing the path for some of these young ladies will affect how they raise their family and how those families will be raised.
Exactly. That's our goal, is to make generational changes, because so many times women will get stuck in a rut, you know, in a cycle between trying to find work and trying to feed their babies. And basically anytime they come to classes, we give them either diapers or formula, whichever they want. And then we have a little thrift store that only our moms can shop in. Everything is pretty much 50 cents. And they can earn money by going to classes, you know, we call them baby bucks, to shop in that thrift store.
Incredible. Thank you so much. Ladies, this is an incredible program. I know you're going to want to help support them, so head on over to our website at momseveryday.com.
For health, home, money, and more, what matters to you and your family is at momseveryday.com.
And welcome back. And of course, what lawmakers really have to struggle with this session, one of the many things, but the big one, I think the elephant in the room, or the 800-pound gorilla, whatever you want to say, is the budget. And you know, this is always the challenge. It seems like every session, but it's a huge challenge this session. We've seen shortfalls. The governor has proposed several different ideas for making up at least a portion of those shortfalls, including borrowing some, and borrowing, I probably say that generously, some money from CAPERS, from the Highway Fund. None of these solutions have people particularly happy, even in his own party. The CAPERS thing was something the governor pointed to as a tremendous success, and I think rightfully so, this last session and the session before. This is a difficult situation for lawmakers.
It is, and it's that it's an old problem about, you know, wanting to cut spending that affects other lawmakers' constituency, perhaps, but not your own. And it's a conundrum for you know, the Tea Party, far right wing, whatever you want to call them. You know, they clamor for limited government and less spending, but then they're out holding signs talking about keeping your hands off of my Social Security or my Medicare, and you know, state pensions across the country as well as the federal government. The biggest driver behind the national debt and deficit spending are the solvency problems with entitlement type of programs. Lawmakers are just going to really have to decide. You know, conservatives gained seats in the legislature 2 months ago. Are they going to go as far as to say, we have a mandate and we campaigned on limited government, smaller government? Are they going to take the blueprint that the Kansas Policy Institute has put forward, in which Dave Trobert says he can balance the state budget in, I think it's 5 years? Are they going to go that route, or are they going to try to play games because they know that there's political ramifications that are very easy to happen because of certain votes that are made if Democrats throw an amendment on something, or if they force some vote on a budgetary matter that cuts, you know, whatever someone thinks is as a necessary service.
Russell, we reelected the governor. We elected more conservatives. It seems like the public is making a statement here that this is the direction we want to go. Will lawmakers just keep heading that direction and starve the beast, as they say?
No doubt.
Had one on our show just the other day that said that.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt there are plenty of people in Topeka who feel that way, and I think it's quite possible that the governor himself feels that way. I mean, he's obviously getting a lot of pushback from a lot of people who are taking a look at, you know, Kansas's bond rating, taking a look at, you know, long-term deficits skyrocketing, and seriously questioning the path that he's on. But he may still be a true believer as well. The political consequences from making hard decisions and following through on this ideological commitment to the night watchman state, the minimal state, you know, starving the beast and all the rest of it. Those political costs and those calculations are very, very real. Let's not get so distracted by the showy and dramatic business of whether this legislator or this governor is going to change his or her mind on this issue, and forget the fact that we're talking about the genuine health of the state. So, like, I mean, let's talk about the highway fund, okay? Governor's talking rather casually about taking an additional $100 million out of the state highway fund. Now, granted, state highway funds, you know, across the country regularly get raided. In Kansas alone, you know, we've probably taken, you know, something like $1.2 billion out of the highway fund in recent years. Nonetheless, think about our state, okay? We are a state whose population is spread out. We're very, very dependent upon roads. The idea that we need strong roads, we need a strong highway budget, we need a reliable source of funding to keep these roads operating is crucial to our economic health, and it's crucial to the whole reputation of the state. When you take a look at Kansas, one of the things that traditionally it's been able to talk about is the fact that we actually network these distant communities together. And are we really going to be, you know, comfortable with the idea that in pursuit of this, you know, low tax utopia, we're going to continue to, you know, rob the money that pays for our ability to, you know, drive out to Liberal, to drive out to Hayes, to do all the things that people who live in Kansas normally do.
Michael, when we hear phrases like starve the beast, I think many taxpayers on the surface will say, well, yeah, the government doesn't need so much money, but when you look at the math that's involved, that's education, or at least 51% or 52%, whatever our budget right now, is education. So if you're going to start starving the beast, you start starving things that people really do care about. And I think that's the quandary that the governor's in.
I agree with you. We need to remember that the state budget, like the federal budget, isn't divided up into equal pieces of the pie. It has some great big huge chunks like what you just mentioned, the biggest of all, the state school-based funding formula. That's a huge one. Roads, which are supposed to be separate from the rest of the budget, are big. Higher education is not as big as K-12, but it's significant. And of course, Medicaid, which has undergone huge changes under this governor and legislature with privatization, is also a very, very large and growing chunk. What Russell was talking about really brought me to mind of what this debate that seems to now be settled between the moderate and the conservative Republicans in Kansas was all about. The old moderates, the Mike Haydens, the Bill Graves, all of these folks. There's the party of good fiscal managers, the party of Dwight Eisenhower, who presided over balanced budget after balanced budget as president and was from Kansas. Not necessarily the party that cut taxes to their absolute lowest possible level, so much as a party that held the line on taxes and was cautious about taxes and was cautious about expanding government. But there was also this sense that there are certain things government needs to do, and you need that fiscal management. For example, protecting the integrity of the Highway Trust Fund. And this team of Republicans that have won are really much more of the Star of the Beast mentality, much more quasi-revolutionary, I think, in their own minds. They really think that government is out of control and it takes really drastic action to contain it. But what's that going to look like when we see it in our own local schools or in the roads we drive on?
Well, and the reality of that, Michael, when you do things, you take money from the highway system, you're not going to see those impacts tomorrow, but you will see those impacts 5, 10 years down the road. And at that point, does it really matter to those lawmakers who may not be in power anymore, but they've left a legacy behind of either success or failure? It depends on how you look at it. I mean, if they're successful and do what they say they're going to do, then they've left a legacy that they want to leave. But if it does lead to problems, it's a whole different legacy.
Yes, I agree. Deferred maintenance, I mean, there you go. There's another one of those classic moderate versus conservative Republican issues. Moderate Republicans are all about, let's not have deferred maintenance. Let's stay on top of those regular road repairs. You used to be able to see it between Missouri and Kansas. Kansas would be digging out roads all the way down to the base and putting in new rebar. Missouri would be slapping another coat of asphalt on top of a crumbly foundation, which would soon start breaking up because the foundation wasn't solid. And now it looks like Kansas is likely to be going that direction, unless this thing with the roads is a one-time thing, because of course the Kansas Policy Institute tells us that these tax cuts are going to bring us economic growth and that this is just a stopgap. But we really have a lot of chips on that number coming up right now.
Russell, quick point before we go to the break.
Oh, just the point that you were making and Michael were making about the fact that these government expenditures, so often they're not very sexy. They're not very exciting. They're, constant maintenance. They're routine things. But if they're not done and if they're not fully funded regularly, if people aren't taking responsibility to look ahead and do the small things regularly that need to be done and pay for them, then the roads start falling apart. Then you start facing the inability for Kansas to operate as Kansas historically has.
All right, let's take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about the latest marijuana petition here in the city of Wichita. We'll be back in a minute.
Every day's a savings day. You can shop the savings way at Jabara's Carpet Outlet.
Every day is a savings day at Jabara's Flooring Superstore.
You'll always save with our everyday low prices, but right now you can save up to 20% more on our huge inventory of remnants.
Every day is a savings day at Jabara's Carpet Outlet.
Moms today are busier than ever. When they have questions, they need answers now, at home, school, or on the go. That's why thousands of busy moms turn to momseveryday.com each day for advice. If your business has experts who can help make mom's life easier, we want to hear from you. Join the Moms Everyday community of more than 1,000 experts across the country and help elevate your business as a local solution for local parents. Real help, local info. Moms Everyday makes mom's life easier. To become a partner, email us at joinus@momseveryday.com.
2014, Cake News has been with you every day of the year. On air, online, on your mobile. Tracking the big stories.
Alerting you to breaking news.
Protecting you and your family.
We've seen tragedy.
We've seen history. We've seen wild weather.
In 2015, trust Cake News to continue delivering the big local stories that are important to you.
Always tracking, always alerting, always protecting. Cake News.
Brr, it's cold out there, and while you and I might take the protection of a warm coat for granted, many of our neighbors struggle with this basic need. The good news is, any old coats you have laying around can still protect someone from cold weather while making you feel warm all over.
Share the warmth. Donate new or gently used coats, sweaters, or blankets at any in-the-bag cleaners now through January 31st. The Salvation Army will distribute them to those in need. Learn more at cake.com.
And welcome back. We saw the pro-marijuana group here in the Wichita area present another petition to the folks at the courthouse in Wichita. And this one is a little different, I think, from the last one. And this one would basically ask that penalties for marijuana possession be lessened.
Right.
Which can't happen.
Well, that was quick. We'll be back after this. Just kidding.
The petition can be accepted, and it can go onto the ballot in April. And if it's voted through, then it goes back to the city council, and the city council tries to decide what they're going to do about it. I was at the city council meeting where the last attempt was discussed. When the secretary of the city had come back and said that they'd missed the number of signatures they needed by, what was it, 36 or something like that.
After all the purges.
And there was some serious questions about that as well. And, there were a lot of people there, and I thought that they made a good case that, ultimately this rests with the city council. So the city council could have gone forward with it anyway. Given the way that particular petition had been written, it probably would have led to a fair number of legal headaches. But the fact is that I think it's very likely that this one is going to lead to a fair number of legal headaches. This is not a high-profile issue, but this is an issue that really engages a lot of people on a very local, what's happening in my neighborhood, what sort of life do I want to live? How is this going to be affecting my family type of level? And so this is going to engage the law enforcement community. It's going to engage the social services community in all sorts of different ways. I really, really hope that the petition gets accepted and that it gets on the ballot and that the city council is forced to wrestle with it in a genuine way.
Rodney, you said it can't happen. Why?
Well, Representative Steve Brunk, who's chair of the Federal and State Affairs Committee in the Kansas House, was quoted in the Wichita Eagle, and a number of other people I've talked to confirm that the city of Wichita municipalities cannot change state criminal statutes.
City ordinance versus state statute.
Right.
State statute wins.
I think Russell's nailed it. I think if the city moves forward on it, it creates a number of legal hassles. I am sympathetic for a lot of reasons on the petition. I think there is an incredible academic, thought-provoking, genuine, real debate to be had about cannabis, about marijuana, about hemp in this country. The tobacco industry, the alcohol industry, the wood industry, the paper industry don't want to have that conversation. Yeah. And so Wichita, Kansas, trying to do something.
You left out the prison industry.
And the prison industry. I'm not sure what this does, and I'm concerned about the level of dialogue and the conversation that this is going to engender. I'm not sure if Wichita or Kansas is ready to have the kind of conversation that Washington and Oregon have had years ago, Colorado had recently. I don't think Kansas is there yet. Maybe this local petition moves us forward in that direction.
See, I think that's the key.
Sure.
It's the sort of thing that can force the conversations to happen. So far, these kinds of conversations, which are important conversations about, the inequity in drug charges against different populations within the city, the consequences of over-incarceration, all of these different things. so far these conversations have been taking place in divided ways amongst small groups of people that really could go ahead and spitball it because it wasn't going to result in any genuine action. Sure. Now, if we can force the argument to actually take place on a city level, which then would trigger the state level to talk about it, maybe we could start moving in that direction.
Michael, let's get your thoughts before we hit to commercial break.
Just to piggyback on Russell's comments, the formal term for that is setting the agenda. This whole idea that if you want an idea to become law someday, you've got to put it out there, and you'll probably fail the first few times, but you keep working at it and keep working at it. People that were thinking 15, 20 years ago one day we're going to have same-sex marriage probably had a lot of friends that thought, I can't believe you actually think that's going to happen. There are movies from as recently as the 1990s that get a huge laugh out of the idea that the United States would have an African-American president. You've got to be kidding me. No way, that's never going to happen. And so these ideas, they may not pass this time, I don't know. But these ideas get on the agenda, and with marijuana, that's one of those issues where there's a huge age gap. Right around age 40 plus or minus, there's this big break in opinion about marijuana, with people on the under 40 side being much more inclined to think that it should not be criminalized. And of course, that portion of the population and the voters is only going to grow over time.
Yeah. All right, let's take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about a recent article in Politico magazine about the new civil rights movement, which we may be seeing right now. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
2014. Cake News has been with you every day of the year. On air, online, on your mobile. Tracking the big stories.
I'm leaving with joy in my heart.
That was an earthquake.
Alerting you to breaking news.
You can see a lot of smoke coming from inside.
Protecting you and your family.
Today's really your day to make some of those preparations.
Ramping up in intensity as we go through the night.
We've seen tragedy.
4 confirmed as deceased.
Woman inside the fire.
We've seen history. We've seen wild weather.
That's a tornado. Like someone was just throwing stuff at our window.
We've said goodbye to old friends.
To the people here at Cake, I say thank you.
And hello to new ones.
Welcome.
Thank you. In 2015, trust Cake News to continue delivering the big local stories that are important to you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching.
Always tracking, always alerting, always protecting. Cake News.
Man, it's cold out there, and while you and I might take the protection of a warm coat for granted, many of our neighbors struggle with this basic need. The good news is any old coat you have laying around can still protect someone from the cold weather while making you feel warm all over.
Share the warmth. Donate new or gently used coats, sweaters, or blankets at any in-the-bag cleaners now through January 31st. The Salvation Army will distribute them to those in need. Learn more at cake.com.
Relive the magic from your favorite Disney movies January 25th at the beautiful Stiefel Theater with the Salinas Symphony and 4 Broadway caliber singers. Disney in Concert, Tale as Old as Time, will feature music and movie clips from Frozen, Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid, The Lion King, and more. Get your tickets today. While you're in Salina, visit the Smoky Hill Museum and see the Life in the 1930s exhibit featuring kid-friendly interactives. Why not spend the night? Call Country Inn Suites and ask for the symphony rate.
A recent article on the Politico news site, their website, talked about Ferguson and the activities in New York recently and things that have happened there, and kind of said this was the start of potentially a new civil rights movement. Michael, I actually want to start off right away with you on this one, because this is one that I think you were pretty interested in. Let's have you kick it off.
Well, sure. I actually have done some work with some bi-state social justice groups in Kansas City. And some of the folks from there have been on the ground in Ferguson. So that article on Politico.com really grabbed my attention. First of all, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, there have been a few instances heavily publicized by the news media of spontaneous rioting that happened a couple nights that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. We're talking about the daily peaceful protests, which are organized by clergy, by community organizers, and in particular by a new, younger generation of civil rights leaders who are organizing through social media, especially Twitter. Ferguson is the longest continuous series of political protests in the United States since the Montgomery bus boycott, initiated by Rosa Parks and led by Dr. King. Something's going on here. If you follow this, you might have noticed the event a while back where the Reverend Al Sharpton was giving a speech in Ferguson, and some younger activists stormed the stage and took the microphone away from him. There's something going on here. These activists are younger, they're less likely to go to church, they're more female, and they have a pretty coherent set of demands, which of course is about policing reform and a new grand jury in the Michael Brown case. And they are organizing differently, and I think they're here to stay.
You know, guys, this is history, I think, in the making, and it's been fascinating to watch. I don't know, your thoughts on what
I can remember attending a kind of a little mini symposium that was put together by Sunflower Community Action and a couple of other groups here in Wichita, maybe about 3 years ago. And it was focused on the writings of this one scholar who published a book called The New Jim Crow. And what it focused on were exactly the sort of issues that Michael was just referring to. The idea that the new civil rights movement, the new push for recognition of the grievances of racial minorities in the United States, all has to do with police reform. It has to do with high levels of incarceration in the United States, with the inequity, the racial inequity in the way drug laws are enforced. You know, a lot of the traditional civil rights concerns are not part of this agenda. It's a different, more focused agenda. It's a very youthful agenda. It was a fascinating symposium to participate in, and it was very eye-opening for me, you know, a white guy in his 40s, to see just the intelligence and the commitment and the drive that was coming from, you know, a lot of these young 20-somethings. And, you know, I don't know if there's any direct connection between these kind of community actions and the sort of thing that Michael is referring to and the political argument the political article was referring to, but it seems to me to be part of the same general phenomenon.
Rodney, a little over a minute.
I'll just say, and again, in full disclosure, you know, I have multiple family members who are law enforcement officials. I have multiple friends who are law enforcement officials, and it just kind of rubs me the wrong way when a lot of this seems to be about, call it, law enforcement police officer reforms or fine, you know, okay, put body cameras on them, that's great. But most, and I'm talking 90–95% of police officers are public servants, they're good people, they're doing a really good job, and it's a small minority of bad ones that are giving them a bad name. And so I wish we could get more of that out of this conversation, other than we just kind of seem to cast a giant aspersion over the law enforcement community. If there is legitimate, you know, kind of structural racism or problems, that needs to be addressed. But I'm not sure circumstances surrounding happenstances of incarceration rates or happenstances of some police incidents necessarily are emblematic of a giant problem.
All right. Well put, guys. Appreciate you being on the program, as always, and appreciate you watching the show. If you have any questions or comments, please email me at thisweekinkansas@cake.com. Thanks for watching again. I hope you have a wonderful
day. Update your kitchen with a new faucet from Moen at Menards. Right now, they're all